So who wrote the first epistle to Peter? Who wrote 1 Peter? Yeah. Well, no. Who composed it? Who was its author? Who decided what words, what sentences, what phrases, the order of the topics? Who's the composer of the letter? It is a letter. Peter? No. No, the Holy Spirit wouldn't be the right answer, because the Holy Spirit doesn't choose the words. Who chooses the words? The person. So, who was the person? Peter. There's a great difference between 1st and 2nd Peter. 1st Peter is the cultured Alexandrian Greek of Alexandrian Judaism, with its typical words and phrases, its catchwords, its typical interests, whereas 2nd Peter is the Aramaic of Palestinian Jewry. The syntax is garbled and a mess because the author writes Greek as if he is speaking Aramaic. The difference between 1st and 2nd Peter, yes, is so great that many liberal scholars have denied Peter's authorship of 2nd Peter because the two books are so extremely different in wording, style, and manner. Today we do computer analyses of these. The same person didn't write the second half of Isaiah who wrote the first half. That's for sure. And the same person didn't write 1 Peter who wrote 2 Peter. Little things like how you use prepositions, what prepositional phrases you choose, where you place the infinitives. Two different people wrote these two books. No, it's very interesting. You can't really tell because the King James Version, translated in English, homogenized the whole Bible. It was all written in 16th century English. And when I read, I generally read out of the Revised Standard Version, which is really a revision of the King James Version. And you get the rhythms of 16th century English no matter what book you're reading. You can't tell that one book is good and another book is bad. You can't tell that Micah can't write and that Amos can. It sounds like they... Yeah, that was a good question. Yeah. Well, boy, if he dictated, he had a hard time moving from dictation to writing the same words down on the paper.
I don't necessarily dictate. I mean, just, giving his thoughts as to what it should be like.
Yeah. Yes, there was, of course, the Roman practice of amanuensis, which is, I want to discuss X, Y, and Z. Please write it out. Yes? We don't. You would have to then follow liberal scholarship that 1 Peter is Peter and 2 Peter is a nobody from the 2nd century. Well, but we have plenty of background information, don't we? That's not correct. To say that we don't have any way of knowing isn't really true. We have lots of indications. And we're going to discuss some of those this morning, not surprisingly. That's what this is all about. Yes. Because where are we still? You can go through a book fairly rapidly and draw out the meat of it if you go do the the exegetical stuff first. We're still at what? Authorship. We're still on number one. Authorship. Yeah. You see, in the Roman world, persons of eminence or importance generally did not write. Not that they couldn't, they didn't. I have said to you that Peter was a person of eminence or importance. I've said, in fact, that the New Testament states clearly that Peter was what? Yes, that's true. But after the resurrection, who was Peter? He was the head of the church. There's no question about that at all. And doubtless he deferred to James among the Jewish Christians. James was the leader of the Jewish Christians. That's certainly true. And that's simply because of James's position as the oldest living descendant of King David. That was a different issue. Among Jews, James had automatic preeminence because of who he was. But certainly among Christians generally, Peter was the head of the church. And was there a human head, a boss? Yes, sure was. There always has been. It's best to get things done by having a boss. Even Paul said that the pillars were Peter and James and John. Even Paul said that. The pillars of the church. And Paul wasn't one to defer to anybody, but he still said that. All right? Now, in Roman literary methods, the person chose his topics and chose his amanuensis or author carefully. Certainly you wanted an author who knew how to write and could express with great literary skill what it was you're trying to get across. Now, of course, the author had the right of veto on any particular word or phrase. It could be redone. Peter tells us how he wrote, in what sense he wrote. What does he say at the end of the work? What does he say? 5:12, what does it say? Yeah. By Silvanus, a faithful brother, as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that which is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it, she who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greeting. Who is this she who is at Babylon? Who's the she who is at Babylon in this passage? Here's another one of those verses that we sometimes would like to skirt around. You don't show that Roman Catholicism isn't true by ignoring the truth in Roman Catholicism. That's not it. You point out the errors in Catholicism, not evading the truth. What's the truth here? Who's the she who is at Babylon? Yeah. The King James is interpreting there, but interpreting correctly. He said, the King James says the church. The she is the Roman church. Where is Peter? Well, I said the Roman church. There's absolutely no doubt that the Babylon of the verse is what? The Babylon of this verse is what? It is the city of Rome. The book of Revelation says that Babylon is the seven-hilled city, right? Yeah, Revelation 17 says Babylon is the seven-hilled city. It's Rome. No question about it. Peter is at Rome. And he's describing something that's going on, the fiery trial that is coming on you. He's addressing the Christians in Turkey, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But Peter is addressing the Christian church in Turkey from Rome. Why was he in Rome? Why was he in Rome? Peter stayed for 11 years in Jerusalem. The vision sent him to the Gentiles. It's, Thomas may have gone to India, but that isn't what Peter saw himself doing, because that isn't what he was instructed to do. That's why Peter and Paul crossed paths. Why? They were both working for the Gentiles. And it happens that both Peter and Paul ended up where? In Rome. In jail. At the same time. Say, you want to know an irony? Have you ever been to Rome? There are people here who have been to Rome? The Basilica of St. Peter. Now, of course, that was the church that started the Reformation. Whenever you look at the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, you have to think of Catholicism and also what else? Protestantism. That was the church that started the Reformation. Of what do I speak? The sale of the indulgences was for what purpose? Yes. The old Cathedral of St. Peter had fallen into centuries-old disrepair, so that there was absolutely no hope of saving it. So the great Borgia popes decided that they would build a church unlike any in history. And they leveled the Vatican Hill to do it. That's one of the 7 hills. It's not there now. Where did it go? It disappeared when they built this massive church over it. And what's it built over? It's built over the tomb of Peter. And that's not a legend. Because when Peter was martyred, the Christians took his body. They were given his body. And in the 2nd century, they talk about the Trophia, the site of the burial of Peter and Paul. Is there a church to Paul? Oh, yes. The church of Paul outside the wall is where Paul is buried. Certainly Peter would, I think, be amazed and probably appalled if he could find out what's over him there in his name. Yes, and in what business it was done. But Peter and Paul were both in Rome, and Peter was there for many years. That's not a legend, that's the truth. All the witnesses from the late 1st century, early 2nd century on, record Peter's apostleship in Rome, and a fairly detailed description of how he ended up, how it happened that Nero had him and Paul killed at the same time. By Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him, I have written briefly to you, exhorting and declaring that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, which is one of his opening remarks, sends you greeting, and so does my son Mark. What's that all about? What Mark is this? This is John Mark, who went with Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey at least halfway. But when they got off the boat in Turkey and they were going to go inland, and you see that huge mountain range right behind the city. And Paul was the kind of person that what? Paul's nature was, if there's a mountain range, what? We're going to go over it, see what's on the other side. John Mark saw the mountain range and said, what? Let's stay here. He was young. He was young. That was the end of his association with Paul. Paul didn't change his mind readily, did he? No. In later years, of course, he was associated with Peter in Rome. And where did Mark end up? Where did Mark end up? Yes, but then he was not killed he left the city. Peter and Paul were already imprisoned, and when Nero's persecution began. John Mark was not imprisoned. Where did he go? He didn't go very far. All right. Where's the Cathedral of St. Mark? In Venice. And that really is where he finished up his life. And it's not built over his grave, but that's where he died. Apparently a martyr's death, but in old age. Papias, his assistant, tells us great details about Mark and Mark's association with Peter. So, here they are. Mark was in Rome at this time. By Silvanus, a faithful brother as I regard him. Who is this Silvanus? Well, we just said he was Peter's amanuensis, the fellow who actually wrote the book at Peter's direction. But who was he? Where did... Yeah, once again, the version is interpreting as it translates, but interpreting correctly. There's never been any doubt, since Silvanus and Silas are the same name. What's the difference between them? The difference between Joseph and Joe. Yeah, it's just, it's the same name used interchangeably in the Greco-Roman world. There's no question that Silvanus is Silas. And who is this Silas who had the nerve to write the words of 1 Peter? Can he do that? Can he do that? Yes, he can do that. Who is he? Paul and Silas in prison, you say? Yes. Well, let's go back to Acts 15 and see what this is about. Do you remember what Acts 15 is offhand? This is one of those memory chapters, a key chapter that you memorize. What is it? It's the Jerusalem Conference. What's that all about? What was the Jerusalem Conference all about? Yes? Well, it was to deal with the crisis created by the gospel going to the Gentiles. This created a tremendous crisis, and I told you before that there isn't any individual who could have brought the gospel to the Gentiles but Peter. No other person would have had the authority or the respect of the other Jewish Christians to take this outrageous move of baptizing Gentiles. Only Peter could have done it. And he did it. And then they decided to send Paul and Barnabas, Joseph Barnabas, the son of encouragement, off on a tour of Gentile cities nearby. Yes. Why was he respected so differently? Because of who he already was. He was Jesus' closest disciple, the top disciple. He was Jesus' right-hand man in life. He was the automatic by-personality leader of the apostles throughout Jesus' ministry. And Jesus gave him that authority in Matthew 16. This is something that as Protestants we like to skirt around, but Jesus gave him that authority. Peter was a rock. Jesus named him that. And it was Peter's responsibility as the rock to point to the great rock who was Christ. Yes?
Wasn't this meeting because the Jewish people all wanted to meet Gentiles based on all of the laws and stuff, the tradition?
Under Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost, what happened? Thousands believed and were baptized. And it says a great company of the priests believed. There were 6,000 priests serving in the temple in Jerusalem. I've said before, it was the largest temple in the world. According to Josephus, 2,000 of those priests approximately were Messianists. What does that mean? It means a third of the priesthood of the Jerusalem temple were Christians. Do you think this created a problem? You think it created a problem for the high priest? Killing Jesus was the beginning of their troubles. The destruction of Jerusalem was the end. And the two were intertwined. They never could get the thing back on an even keel. Actually, if I have to tell the whole story, the truth is that the temple in Jerusalem never was on an even keel. It was never finished, right? They were still building it the day it was destroyed. And there were constant riots and revolts and attempted revolutions while the temple was being built that emanated from the temple. Part of the problem was there was too much of a concentration of wealth and power in one point, right? And there was too much messianic hope in the air. One of those rebellions in 6 AD ended Herod Archelaus' rule. He could only quell the rebellion by killing 30,000 people in the temple courts, and he was finished. Could the Roman government put up with that? It almost sparked a rebellion throughout the Roman world. That was the end of him. So another of Herod's sons had to take over. There was constant trouble, and as if there wasn't enough trouble, now the priesthood in the temple was divided. Now these lower priests were not the liberals. It was the Sadduceic house, the upper priesthood, the Sanhedrin who ran the country, who were the cultured people, who were liberal and didn't worry too much about things like the resurrection and the law. But the lower priests were liberal or conservative. They were very conservative. And when Peter took the gospel to the Gentiles, what did this great body of Christian believers in Judah want and expect? There wasn't any doubt what they expected. It was a given. Nobody would have even thought of it, except that the apostles did wrong in their eyes. What did they fully presume? Judaism had been making converts by the thousands in the century preceding Christ's time. There was a huge number of Gentiles who had been converted to Judaism. And when they converted to Judaism, what did they do? They became Jews in every sense of the word. They lived the conservative Jewish lifestyle. And so when Christians were made of Gentiles, it was assumed that what? They'd be Jewish Christians, that's right. They may be Italian, but they were expected to be Jewish Christians. And the apostles ignored this. And it caused great... Now, this was a clash of culture as well as theology. And so they had this conference to decide what to do. And they came up with these rules that are listed here in chapter 15, verse 19. And James is speaking because they're in Jerusalem where James is the head of the church and where James is in authority. And he says, "Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble the Gentiles who turn to God, This is James. James the Pharisee. You understand that the reason that Jesus' teaching was similar to the Pharisees was that the family of Jesus were Pharisees. They were leading members of the Pharisaic sect. Oh, there I go again. I thought Joseph and his family were peasants. Right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll say wealthy peasants. Besides which, you know, if you stop and think about it, how would it happen that the family of David would be obscure peasants? Do you think that would work in Judaism? It wouldn't work, and it didn't work. They weren't obscure peasants, and it was the murder of Jesus' older brother James, by Ananus II, the high priest, while the Roman procurator was away for 3 months, that started the Roman-Jewish War in 66 AD, that ended with the destruction of the temple and that Judaism. Okay? I said that the murder of Jesus was the beginning of the end, and they never got it back to where it could survive. And when they murdered James, then it was really over. That was the thing that in 3 months ended it, because, of course, the lower priesthood revolted when the leader of the Christian church was killed by the high priest. The high priest thought that in the absence of the Roman governor, he had enough power that he could risk killing James. And it was a risk that, he should not have taken. The whole of Jerusalem flew out of control. By the time the Roman governor got there, it was too late. Well, this is James speaking. Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the pollutions of idols, and from unchastity, and from what is strangled, and from blood. Now, James is being practical here. What are these rules all about? The thing that had sparked it was when Peter and the other leaders were eating with the Gentile Christians, and then the Pharisaic Christians came down and said, you can't do this. It made Peter unclean to eat with these people who were unclean, and these were the things that made a person unclean before he ate. James is simply asking the Gentiles to refrain from a few things that would make them unclean before eating. So that what? So that Jewish Christians of fine sensibilities could eat with Gentile Christians without becoming unclean. So this is a sop to whom? James is making these rules on behalf of what group? The Jews. He doesn't even think these rules are important. Why has he listed them? So that Jewish Christians can eat with Gentile Christians without becoming unclean. He's concerned about his great flock of Jewish Christians, particularly in Palestine. That's what it's all about. Now it says, then it seemed good to the apostles and the elders with the whole church to choose men from among them and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. Of course, Antioch had become at this point was the great non-Jewish Christian center. Okay? They sent Judas called Barsabas and Silas, leading men among the brethren, with the following letter. What did you catch there? The first time we ever hear the name, the very first time we ever hear of him, what is he called? A leading man among the brethren. Well, Silas, what kind of a name? What kind of a name? Silas. Silvanus. What kind of a name? Silvanus. What? Italian. Latin. Sure. It's a Latin name. Is he a Jew? Yes. Saulus. Saulus. What kind of a name? Yeah. It's not from Saul of the Old Testament. Saulus is a how do you say Greekization? Hellenization, there's a word, of the Old Testament Saul. Paulus. Paulus. What kind of a name? Yeah, it is. Petros. Greek. Paulus. Greek. Silvanus. Latin. But Paul was what? What was his ethnic background? He was a Jew. Petros. Petra, Greek. Okay, so Peter had a Greek name and a Latin name. But what was he? He was a Jew named Simeon. Paul was a Jew named Saul. Right? But they had these Roman names. How did you get a Roman name? What? By being a citizen. How did you get to be a citizen? Yes, that's right. There are two ways. Number one was you are born that way. For one thing, you might be an Italian. If you're an Italian, unless you were a peasant, a pagani, you were born that way. Or what? Money. Money? A lot of money. And there was also another test. You not only had to have the money to buy it, you had to pass a certain test in culture. They asked you questions. You know, when somebody becomes an American citizen, they ask you questions. You have to know the three branches of government. You have to know the president's the head of the executive branch, that sort of thing. They asked questions. Now, for Jews outside of Palestine, there was a serious problem. If you lived in Alexandria, where there were 70,000 Jews, and the Jewish population was 40% of the city, and you owned a lot of stuff, what did you need to do to make business go well? What did you have to do? Well, because look, the concentration of trade and wealth in the Roman world was in Jewish hands. The Roman emperors knew that. The Jews couldn't let just non-Jews run things. They couldn't afford to, and I mean that monetarily, as well as religiously. The Jews in a place like Tarsus or Antioch or Rome or Alexandria had a serious problem to face. They had to run things. They had to take part in the city government. They had to tell the Roman government what needed to be done. And generally, Roman governors succeeded to local politicians. They knew how to make the empire run smoothly. Make sure trade runs smoothly. That's what they built those roads for. The roads followed the army, and trade followed the roads. Yes. The Romans didn't have an empire just to be the military kings, right? They had an empire what? To be rich. Yeah. A Jewish family had a choice to make that was a difficult and agonizing one. When your sons came of age, when did your sons come of age? No, when they reached puberty, 12 or 13. When your sons came of age, what did you have to decide? Shall we continue to keep them exclusively in the Pharisaic model and separate from the Gentiles, in which case they'll have no influence? Or shall we send them to the gymnasium and give them a classical education, in which case they will become what? Roman citizens, but what's the danger of this acculturation? That they'll leave the tradition of the fathers. And so the Jewish world developed a method for this. You sent your bright young sons to the gymnasium and you made them Greco-Roman. But you schooled them in the tradition of the fathers in a special way, how it relates to the Greco-Roman world. There were plays, the play Jerusalem and many others, that were played in the Roman theaters about the history of Judaism. There was this constant mingling of Jewish and Greco-Roman traditions. Moses was Musaeus, the father of the Muses. Moses, Greco-Roman Jews were told, Moses was the father of the arts and the sciences. The Mosaic Law was trotted out with its health laws as an example to show that Moses was the founder of Greco-Roman medicine. Solomon was the philosopher king, the ideal that Plato was talking about. Okay? There came to be a kind of Judaism that said Judaism is the founder of all the good things in the Greco-Roman world. Okay? Moses was the original great philosopher. Judaism is the great original truth of antiquity from which everything else descended. In the great Museum of Alexandria, with its 500,000 volumes, what did Ptolemy ask be done? He asked, because of the influence of the Jews in his city, that something be done that hadn't been done before. He asked that the Jewish scriptures be translated into Greek, the language of culture in the Greco-Roman world. It was the first translation. It was the first great translation. It was considered a prize work in the Museum of Alexandria because under a Greek king, the first massive translation was done. And that translation was the translation of the Old Testament. No massive translation had ever been made before. And this, of course, brought the Jewish scriptures to the Greco-Roman world. All right? Now then, Paulus, Saul, Saul, Silvanus, who were these people? They were these non-Palestinian Jewish families whose background was in Judaism and the gymnasium. That's why Apollos could preach in such literate Greek and preach to the Greeks, and why Silvanus could write beautiful Greek. Okay? How did Peter get to be a Roman citizen? He wasn't a Roman citizen in Galilee. Yes, he was a freeborn Jew. He was not a peasant. But how and why would he have gotten to be a Roman citizen? Obviously, he himself or the church at large felt it necessary because of his ministry and work that what? Because of his ministry and work, it was obvious that they felt what? That he needed to be a Roman citizen. Yes. Do you remember when they beat Paul and Silas and put them in prison? What was the governor's horror the next day? Well, it wasn't Paul. What did they say? In saying, we'll forgive you for doing this to us, even though we are Roman citizens. It wasn't just Paul. What? It was Paul and Silas, who were Roman citizens. He was a Roman citizen. Well, what was the problem with that? No, what was the penalty for such a mistake? Yes, Roman law was very explicit. The penalty for such a serious mistake was death. The governor was in serious danger. So when they said, we'll forgive you for that, that was good news. Yeah. Now, what was Silvanus doing in Jerusalem? One of the leading brethren. Well, not surprisingly, Christianity caught on very quickly among these Hellenized Jews. They fought the Great Maccabean Wars to make sure that Judaism was not Hellenized. And they won the war. But what? Yes, that's right, they lost the peace. Because, of course, after they fought these great wars to make sure that they were not Hellenized, then what did they do in the next 2 centuries? Yes, they became the center of the business of the Greco-Roman world. Now, what was he doing there? Well, we find out in Acts that there were Greco-Roman Jews right in Jerusalem. It was Stephen. Stephanos. Oh, Stephanos what? Another one of those Jews with a Greek name who was an Italian name who was what? Another one of those Roman citizens there, preaching to the Hellenized Jews in Jerusalem and making converts. All right? So he was killed, but of course Paul was chosen to take his place. That was the point. Paul stood by holding the coats. He didn't know that he was going to be Stephen's successor. Yes, now, Silvanus was already there, a leading Hellenized Jew, and there's something else about him that's very important. They sent Judas, Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren, with the following letter. The brethren, both the apostles and the elders, to the brethren who are of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia, greeting. To the brethren who are of the Gentiles. To the brethren who are of the Gentiles. I said, the day Peter entered Cornelius' house was the day the modern Western world began. Since we have heard that some persons from us have troubled you with words, unsettling your minds, although we gave them no instructions, it has seemed good to us in assembly to choose men and send them to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the sake of our Lord Jesus Christ. Oh, they sent people with Barnabas and Paul with the report. Wasn't it good enough to just send Barnabas and Paul with the report? No. Why? Because if Barnabas and Paul came back with the report, James and the other Christians and the apostles at the church, at the head of the church, decided that you don't have to do anything, what would people have said? Yeah, well, that's what Paul and Barnabas wanted anyway. They're just bringing back their opinion of what happened. And James understood that the Christians in Antioch would not necessarily believe it just because Paul and Barnabas said it. All right? To choose men and send them to you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the sake of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas, who themselves will tell you the same things by word of mouth. Now this is standard Roman procedure. I told you before, the governor of Asia wants to speak to the governor of Pontus Bithynia about some matter. How does he communicate? He does it in two ways. He writes a letter. That's stello, to write. And he sends something with the letter. Apostello. Apo is with. Apostello, to send somebody with the writing. You see, you break the seal and you read the letter. Governor A is talking to Governor B about something important. But what has he sent along with the letter? He sent a person that he's talked to about the problem, who has talked to him personally and knows the background. This person who went with the letter can elaborate on the letter, can tell more about what it was all about than the letter could tell. This person in the Roman world was called the what? The apostle. That's why there are no apostles in the church today. Somebody says, I'm an apostle to Jesus. No, you're not. There are no apostles today. Why? The apostles were people what? Were people, yes, who had talked with Jesus and could tell personally what the background was about. That was the whole idea of the office. Yes. Now then, that's because they don't know what the word means. For it has seemed good to the Holy Spirit, verse 28, and to us, to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from unchastity. If you keep yourselves from these, you do well. Farewell. Roman letters were generally short. So, when they were sent off, they went down to Antioch, and having gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter. And when they read it, they rejoiced at the exhortation. And Judas and Silas, who were themselves prophets. Did you get it? And Judas and Silas, who were themselves prophets, exhorted the brethren with many words and strengthened them. Oh, I see. When Paul talked about the authority of the offices in the church in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14, what was his list? What was his hierarchy? Apostles, number 1. Prophets is number 2. Teachers is number 3. Administrators is way down the list. Yes. In fact, the only thing of lesser authority than being an administrator was to have the gift of tongues. Yes, I know. Yes. Silas had not known Jesus personally or talked with him personally, right? Otherwise he would have been what? An apostle. But he did have what? The gift of prophecy. Remember the famine in the reign of Claudius that Agabus had predicted? There were prophets in the church. Silas was one of those. The gift of prophecy was given to these cultured, wealthy Jews with a gymnasium education. This is why Paul sometimes quotes from pagan poets. Why you get snatches of Greco-Roman literature in New Testament books. He had that education. It's why we're going to find in 1 Peter that Jesus descended into hell and preached to the spirits who were imprisoned in Tartarus. What is Tartarus? Well, this book here that we're going to read says that when Jesus died, he descended into hell and preached in the prison to the spirits that were imprisoned in Tartarus. What is Tartarus? You have to know the Greco-Roman background to have some idea what that is about. Stay tuned. All right. Now, so is it a problem then in the matter of inspiration to say that as far as the actual words of the book or the actual structure of the book, that it was Silas doing the writing? No, it's no problem at all. It wouldn't have been a problem even if he didn't have the gift of prophecy. That he did have the gift of prophecy helps. Peter wouldn't have thought to say that Jesus preached to the spirits imprisoned in Tartarus. That would not have been something that he would have thought to say. But interestingly, did he strike it out? No, he didn't strike it out. It's right there. All right. Now then, who were themselves prophets, exhorted the brethren with many words and strengthened them. And after they had spent some time, they sent them off in peace by the brethren to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord, with many others also. So Silas went where at this point? He went back to Jerusalem. So how does he come to be with Paul again later? Well, then we have the second missionary tour. And then what happened? Do you remember what happened? How the third missionary tour came about? Chapter 18 and verse 22. We have Apollos from Alexandria. Apollos, what kind of a name is Apollos? Huh? And he's a native of Alexandria. Again, what kind of a person are we dealing with? Paul has Joseph Barnabas and Silas and Apollos around him. Who are these people, Roy? Who are these people? These are the people Paul worked with. Who are these people? They're people like himself. They're the same social class. They're that upper class, wealthy Jewish family who sent their sons to the gymnasium to become Roman citizens, who paid for it dearly. What did they expect their sons to do, to become? Yes. And what? Merchants and what? What was the whole purpose of being a Roman citizen? Why did these Jewish families want their sons to be Roman citizens? So that they could travel freely? Yes. So they could be unhindered? Yes. What else? So that they could be governors of the local cities. So that they could be members of the city council or the local mayor. They didn't call him mayor, they called him governor, the governor of the city. Why did they want Jewish governors and city councilors? They wanted those laws and regulations that favored Jewish trade. Okay? The parents of Paul did not want him traveling around the Roman Empire preaching Jesus, right? They wanted him to be running a trade, and you can be sure that's what Apollos' parents wanted. That's what Silas's parents wanted. Their plans were changed by the coming of Christ. But that's who this class was. This class really is the class that spread Christianity. This Hellenized Jewish class was the group that took it. One reason that it was not a big problem for Paul and Silas to travel around like this, or Paul and Barnabas or Apollos, was what? They had been trained for that. Part of their gymnasium training was somebody with their background was told what was in the Roman world and where it was and what the products were, what the cities were like, and what the travel routes were like, and part of the training was travel. So it wasn't difficult for these people to move around. Why? That was the life for which they had been trained. And it is so natural then that this group of people starts these missionary tours. Why? That's what they would have been doing anyway, only for their own merchant purposes, for wealth originally, but now to spread the gospel. Interesting how people's backgrounds were used by the Holy Spirit, right? Yeah. Okay. Nothing's happened. We'll just keep going. All right. Now, how did it happen that Silas replaced Barnabas? Where's that story? Right at the end of 15? Okay. Verse 36, is it? And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the brethren in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." And Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp contention so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, being commended by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Interestingly, just because Barnabas didn't go with Paul didn't mean he stayed there. What did he do? Yes, he left anyway. He was going to travel anyway. That's who these people were. It has been noted that there are a great many similarities of wording, phrasing, and theology between 1 Peter and the book of Ephesians. Is this surprising? Things that are found only in Ephesians and 1 Peter. Is that surprising? Mm-hmm. Who was with Paul at the time? Silas. And now who's writing 1 Peter? Silas. What is also interesting is that Paul's great doctrine, which is what? Justification by faith, is never mentioned in 1 Peter. This was not a great interest of the Apostle Peter. And Silas reflects Paul when he's with Paul, and reflects Peter's chief concern when he's with Peter. Okay? Now, we've done authorship. What do we have to do next? After authorship comes what? Well, no, we never get to content yet. Authorship what? Date, authorship, date, and place, and intended audience. We have to know who he's writing to before a lot of it's going to make sense. Thank you very much.